Hello everyone, today we talk about the sources for medieval animals, looking through encyclopedias, treatises, bestiaries, etc. as an introduction to the series that I started last month, that we are updating now for second video, about, in fact, the animals in the medieval imaginary, rather. And today we will clarify, also methodologically speaking, what this is going to be about and how and where even people just want to have broader orientation where to search for informations like this can be found, right? And so this is not going to be, as we will see, reflection on sources about animals to cook, because this actually can be found in a wide variety of areas, but rather, in fact, the ones that tell about the allegorical, symbolical reading that the medieval man did, imagining the animal as such, and attributing to it specific meanings, and that became a metaphor to describe other elements that sometimes had properly nothing to do with the zoological side of the story. This is also, as we will see, a difficult task, as fundamentally there is no Middle Ages as such. There is no, there's not a univocal perception and rationalization, idealization, imagination of all of this. And in order to have a greater understanding of this stuff, we will have to bring examples of actual animals. We will start from next time. And of course, we are talking also about beings that are not animals as such. It may be monsters and other imaginary animals as such, as the medievals substantially believed. Right? They didn't see much of a difference between a dragon and a rabbit conceptually. They all belonged to the same reality that was to be deciphered as such. These were not just fantasy exercises. There was, as we've said before, this deep and serious concern about really understanding the creation. Right? In this series, we will talk, of course, even about, necessarily for understanding the medieval perspective, also about the ancient beliefs that also survived during the Middle Ages, that survived Christianization, that were part of a pagan background rather, for example, than a monotheistic one. But it's obvious that there was a great process of stratification, right? We can't take these visions, these allegories, as just a mere invention of just one author, because everything was conceived on the base of authority, but also actual observation and other folkloristic traditional views that are in fact difficult to even objectify as such, but that we know were there, right? So we will expand all these things better once again once we will deal with the specific animals, so everything will be clearer. But let's talk today just about the sources as such. So as we have just said, to form this complex animal world in the late antique culture flowed different tendencies. Two main ones, specifically, and especially when we're talking about kind of higher culture and what approach the let's say the scientific side of the story from their perspective, right? So, in fact, properly the scientifical and rationalizing one that had been started by Aristotle from one side, and the other being the magical, even astrological one, influenced by the gnostic doctrines, right? And according to which, according to the latter, the cosmos was basically interwoven of occult relations, by occult relations that connected the stars, the animals, the heavens, the earth, water, plants, stones, right? So in fact, it's very difficult even to find properly a work that deals only and specifically with animals in this regard, as these were framed in a much greater cosmological view altogether, right? And this is something that we're not used to much, just because of the of the scientific revolution and the rationalization of thought, and the classification and secularization of the Enlightenment, and so on. But also because we have lost largely the the purpose and the mental exercise to conceive knowledge altogether as part of a unitary ensemble, right? So behind, and that's why these representations and of animals, other creatures, are so interesting, because they're all part of a broader meaning that cannot be detached in a merely zoological interest when we look at them. So on these two models, right, was eventually developed the imaginary zoology of the Middle Ages, right? And this stemmed largely from the vast encyclopedical production that was created between the 7th and the 12th century, right? And eventually boosted further in the what can call pre-scientific attitude of the 13th century, the great century of scholastics, and also of the full integration of Aristotle in the cosmological view of Christianity, in Christian Europe at least. And so, in spite the plurality of the styles, also the differences in sources, such literary genre doesn't, as we were saying before, represent a disorderly mishmash of fantasy, right? But it preserves in itself an intimate coherence, for understanding which it is necessary only essentially to decodify its language, right? To which, as we've said, we're not used anymore, because we don't see the bigger picture that stood behind this, at least usually. But not even for this is nothing to do but how much you know the Middle Ages, because objectively we don't know how that really was, right? And that, of course, we have just a partial view also on what this, as we've seen, somewhat higher literary traditions fundamentally were about, right? Needless to say, a common peasant, so I don't know, a stag in a much different way than all the various important, even theological symbolism that existed, right? Or maybe it actually considered it, of course, but still with shades and and different ideas that we can't unfortunately grasp. So the sources through which we can start the studying of animals during the Middle Ages are really many, right? And in here we also have to distinguish the aim, right? Because if we have like an objective interest in the reality of the animal world at the time, but also we have to look at something, while if we instead care about the representation that, for example, the role that they had within the culture of the time, it's a different thing, right? There are naturally overlapping points, but it's still a different direction. So just to make some practical examples, the documents relative to the land exploitation can provide us with information about domestic animals, right? Of livestock and of their costs, right? The military documents tell us a lot of things about horses, obviously enough. The statutes of the city and rural communes inform us about the relations between the animals and the communities. At a strictly economical point of view. And the chronicles, the novels, the geographies provide us with, a sum of particulars about everyday life. The encyclopedias, the treatises, right? And finally, those specific works that are called bestiaries offer us the frame of scientific knowledge of the time and of the ethical etymological meaning that was attributed to them. Right? Then there is all a based literature of Aesopic origin, right? That was translated in tales or even in theatrical plays, for example, of clownish type, right? Think about the Roman de Renard, right? And all of its emanations, by the way. There are different versions, and these were heavily even satirical works. They had, True Animals was all a political satire about the great of the time, society, etc. And next to the written sources, then also we have naturally the iconographical one, as you can see from this video, for example. And we have also informations about the physical characteristics of animals that we draw from archaeology, for example. Think about the early Middle Ages and the barbarian practice of burying certain animals together with men. But even think about garbage depots that show us leftovers like the one of food, etc. And there is an profitable inquiry led with the help of osteology as well. So we are in a time in history in which historical science can really provide us with also a quantity of object, of materials, of rests, remains that are very, very useful to understand the reality also of the geological side. But as we were saying at the beginning, here we will deal relatively few with the reality of the animal presence in medieval society, right? And it's obvious that we can't ignore completely this side of the story, but we will use it rather like a term of comparison for better solving our most concrete problem, that is actually what was the role, to understand what was the role, the meaning, the position of real or imaginary animals in medieval culture as a whole. And in order to frame well this topic, we must, of course, stress what we said also before, is that late antique and early medieval culture was not univocal, right, about this subject specifically, and it presented itself, on the contrary, like the result of many components. It was highly stratified, and it kept being so over time. So it's all obvious also that when we get better information, this is loaded also with in later medieval times. This is connected with a lot of other sources and traditions and information that were elaborated from before, and it doesn't get much easier, right, to understand what was in the between, right? So from one side we can spot the scientific component, right, that was mainly tied to the scientific to the Hellenic scientific legacy, right? This is this way of dealing with nature in a categorical way, right? In starting to question not much just about the role of that specific creature as such, but whether there is something in common, for example, between different animals, right? This was not to be given for granted in in previous times. Of course, this had occurred, naturally speaking. Animals were seen together, right? Not just like plants were classified ideally, but the idea was still that every single being had let's say a different nature from the other. Where in another it was true for men, in part it was true for animals as well, so that their symbolism, their role in the world was not so so to be given for granted, right, as part of a broader system. Well, the Greeks start with realizing, thinking in these terms, which is largely also what we do today. Then, in fact, there is also the survival of the mythical slash magical component that was instead inherited by the Oriental cultures that still, conceived the world in a kind of a more, in fact, mystical way, if you want, and that had penetrated successfully the same Hellenic and eventually Roman cultures, and influenced them accordingly. Even the Greeks and the Romans were the rationalist, secularized thinkers. Quite very, but I mean very, very far from that. Right? These were cultures that still, they started thinking something different next to this kind of more mystical world, but also they largely still believed in it, and therefore they also essentially incorporated this information, or it was already even at the base of their own cultures as well. I mean, think about the Indo-European legacy of such, as we will see later, better, but also the fact that even civilizations like the Greek ones emerged fundamentally, as at the margins of this greater Oriental ones that had thought the symbology of these creatures in a developed way many millennia before. Then, of course, and this synthesis with the Hellenic and Roman world occurred intensely since the 3rd century BC, in those and eventually in those Hellenistic environments, but it's actually a much even older dynamic in general. Then, of course, there's the Christian component that was naturally the legacy of the Jewish world, but also in part of the same Hellenistic one, so the Hellenic Oriental one, and this should not be overlooked, but yet this tradition had somewhat developed also its own symbolism, its own way of framing that symbolism, at least in a specific direction. Then there is the tribal, shamanic one, brought by the cultures of the steppes that had settled in the European and Mediterranean world after the migrations of peoples during the 3rd, 10th century AD, and that, however, were somewhat very close to the same origins even of the pre-existing populations Indo-Europeans and non-alike, and in which the animals had a very important, very primary value and significance. Right, that was in fact true for largely also for this other populations that, as we have seen, had all but lost such such legacies also from the previous millennium. This will be particularly evident when we will talk better about cavalry, for example, from the other side, the one that materialized under the influence of the Gnostic doctrines, as we've seen. So, in a number of works of magical, astrological character, according to which the cosmos was, as we have seen before, all interconnected, so in which every single element, from the heavens to the stones to animals, water, land, etc., were connected, were all tied to each other to certain specific by certain specific forces and powers that operated transversally right through them. And that's exactly from here that all the signs of bestiaries, herbaries, lapidaries would have started, right? And yet, in these works, the scientific rational observations, the philosophical visions and magical arguments would have been unbearably united with ethical-allegorical elements were assumed from the Christian scriptures, for example, and with empirical data drawn from the folkloristic traditions, and the very varied ones. ones in this regard. So think at how this operated over the long run, right? Think about how even the development of certain works. Think about the Encyclopedia of Isidore of Seville that was composed, in the early Middle Ages, and how it would remain for most of the Middle Ages themselves, the encyclopedia par excellence of the Christian. Well, that emanated originated from a very specific area that was invested by many different and somewhat narrow and specific circumstantial information that, as we will see, were also kind of invented on the spot, or at least put together, right, in an original way that was typical of that area, and then a different area of Europe had a different development, right? So it's from here that really stems the impression of that, let's say, confuse us in a way, and that bring us erroneously to try these forced rationalizations from the outside that are far but correct in historically speaking, because they do not even catch the intimate syntax and coherence of the same works, right? So it's obvious that every single work, every single source must always be considered within its own specific context, right? And without which not much can have a great significance, right? Objectively, with the Middle Ages, great part of our culture still behaves in this way, right? It's like seeing that it's weird, right? How many memes about weird illuminations with animals that do strange things, like fashion. But where's the interest behind that, right? How does that, push people to be actually more interested in these things and not seeing it as a weird stuff from, the prejudices and stereotypes we have in the Middle Ages, and even, by the way, that are spoiled by the fact that that's also generally a narrow time and or space. For example, for that type of source, especially certain styles we see are mostly low medieval, right? And they are somewhat even not already secularized, but they're not so serious, so highly conceived, so symbolically meaningful as it could be, for example, the ones of previous centuries, or also at that time in different sources and different representations. But I say in the 4th century BC, Aristotle, the great Aristotle, had attempted this first systematization of the zoological notions of his time, right? This came out in different works. One was the history of animals, the parts of animals, the generations of the animals, the movement of the animals. However, during the Middle Ages, as you know, Aristotelic science was lost, right? It was largely lost. It was recovered indirectly, by the way, during the 12th and the 13th century, and through the Byzantine and Arab medium, right? So, of course, the West knew many, especially Latin works that were variously inspired by Aristotle, and that were comparing, with him, right, in a way. But since there was no original to compare, the Western world couldn't appreciate fully its significance up to the late Middle Ages in this regard. So a very essential link between Aristotle and the Latin Middle Ages was the Naturalis Historia of the famous polygraph and naturalist of 1st century AD, Pliny the Elder, who inspired essentially by, especially the history of animals by Aristotle, dedicated to the world of zoology, the books from the 8th to the 11th of his own treaty. So Pliny, however, behaved differently from Aristotle, that, as we've said before, had actually taken out, or remembered, just to confute them, all the legends that regarded the animals that already this time circulated that he hadn't had the possibility to confute, right? Or that he deemed as a fruit of the imagination, right? At the same time, Aristotle hadn't cared about monsters and mythological creatures that naturally at the time were all over the place in in Hellenic culture as well as in others. Pliny, on the contrary, gave space to all of this, right? He drew from all a series of sources, also of Eastern origin, and therefore bringing in this way within the eventually late antique culture and the medieval one, all this world of essentially of also of imagination, of course, but of therefore of all the meanings, the symbolisms indirectly that were attached to it, right? And for this very reason, the same reliability of Pliny varies, right? Depending on his sources. For example, for the exotic animals that he didn't know, or at least he knew of very few, he still relied on Aristotle, right? At some level. Then on another, also travelers or mythographers, especially of Greek origin, that abundant of descriptions of monsters and of marvels, right? Think about, since, I don't know, Herodotus himself. While, for example, for domestic animals, he uses Columella and the Latin writers that were keen on agrarian matters, like in Roman tradition, and that Columella was also an important source, an appreciated and very well known source during the Middle Ages. So think about this, even the realization in perspective that there were certain sources that were somewhat more reliable, right? Together with Pliny, another honorable mention, at least, is Caius Julius Solinus, that lived between the 3rd and the 4th century AD, whose Collectanea Rerum Memorabilium provided the Middle Ages with wide cognitions on monsters and faraway lands. Eventually, between the 5th and the 12th century, medieval culture was based essentially on the scriptural exegesis and on the comment of the authoritates, right? That is, from the writers of the antiquity that had been translated often or resumed in Latin, and such studying was therefore essentially ethical-allegorical. The scientific data, for example, didn't have in this age an autonomous value per se, right? But they rather served to intend and to well understand in which ways the power of God was displayed in creation. And since in the monastic and eventually episcopal schools there was a great use of the Aesopic tales, translated, brought into Latin by Phaedrus, where animals essentially lent human voices and behavior, and where from the animal histories was drawn a moral teaching. Here it is that exegetic culture, right, and Aesopic morals essentially were blended in an attitude that to the animal world didn't look much for drawing information about zoology, for example, but rather for assuming certain informations at the ethical and allegorical level, right? For example, the notion that the lion cancels its own prints on the terrain was not, nobody really cared whether this was for real or not, but by applying the exegetical system to the four senses of scriptures, it was, let's say, acknowledged that the naturalistic datum provided at a literal level corresponded to a superior reality in the context of which the lion became the symbol of Christ that cancelled the sins of the world, for example. And therefore this attitude was maintained towards the animal world, and also in the same identical way towards the plants in the herbaries or to the stones in the lapidaries, by all the vast encyclopedical production that arrived to the 12th century, and that, as we've remembered before, had as its fundamental base the Etymologia of Isidore of Seville, wrote in the 7th century, but also, for example, in the De Rerum Natura of Bede of the 8th century, and in the De Universum by Rabanus Maurus in the 9th century. And as a kind of assumption of this encyclopedical culture, and also to our understanding of the same, is that nature, that is scripture as such, as it's essentially the reflection of the divine revelation, and that therefore it would have been a banal and dangerous curiosity to know it by itself, right? Because objectively that awareness, that knowledge can never be fully reached, at least from an intellectual point of view, from an intellectual path per se, scientific one. So the wise doesn't have to aim at the comprehension of the objective links between things that remain still something superficial compared to reality, but rather to the relations between God and the things, right? And it is in this order of ideas that it's not important to know the intimate structures or the actual habits of a lion, but rather understanding in which sense it can be the figure of Christ, right? Or in a different context, for example, the figure of Satan. So in the 13th century, as we've seen before, in the revival of the Aristotelian science in the West, that will have a dramatic impact in the progress of modern science, right? And that the outcomes and consequences of which will not be immediately visible as such. So the encyclopedias, for example, and the treatises of Vincent de Beauvais, or of Roger Bacon, of Albertus Magnus, Thomas of Cantimpré, will mark towards the animals, and not just towards them, a different way to intend information and observation, right? And of such different attitude is changed, for example, the Arte Venandi cum Avipos of the Emperor Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, who at his court encouraged the naturalistic speculation and writing of treatises of synergetic, that is, hunting with dogs, of hippiatry, so health and medicine for horses, essentially. And consider here we are at the peak of feudal culture, also from a military point of view, having cavalry and so on. So these were natural developments also, if you think about investment and knowing how to handle a horse. So all works, however, in which with the chance of hunting or the cure of the horse's illnesses, also nature was attemptedly investigated. In his De Arte Venandi, Frederick demonstrates to have fully understood the methodological lesson of Aristotle, since he doesn't hesitate to confute the same great Hellenic philosopher when the information that is proposed by him do not seem to coincide with the experience assumed from direct observation, right? And this is also very, important step forward, as not a passive, which had never really been there in the Middle Ages, but kind of acceptation of what the authorities said, but also the ability of going past that, because there is a method here that is being taught. You don't just have to try to reconcile the authorities with what you know by real, but you can even go beyond and say this authority can be wrong. And now we have the philosophical and scientific instruments to observe nature on our own. Right, this is an enormous step in global civilization in general. So the 13th century, the century of scholastic rationality, didn't, however, eliminate the ethical-allegorical culture. Right, this would essentially remain for a longer time. It was not even a way of intending reality as such. It was simply an attitude. Right, a sort of pre-scientific, this will do as long as we don't find something better, right? Rather than, for example, a expressive language depending on a specific view of the world, right? In this sense, medieval man is dramatically open-minded, right? I can't think of a single moment in history in which the idea that everything could be still framed within the understanding was as large as in the Middle Ages. And naturally, also after Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, the animals continued to be signifiers as such, that is, to constitute some signs that sent back, that referred to our realities of different order. Let's put it in this way. Also because these scientific notions derived from the past didn't explain everything, right? So there was still room for a lot to explain in the first place. You're talking about animals, and many of them actually, even in here, there were legions, information about animals that hadn't still been classified, it hadn't been understood even, right? That could ever changing in this sense. But think about the sky, right? The stars, and this kind of let's say pseudo-scientific, but we would define today pseudo-scientific understanding was normal for for explaining at the moment what still wasn't proven factually, right? And this is also why the whole thing was so very open to further explanation, and you can easily see it as the medieval man always wonders what the hell is going on, right? It doesn't stop to just it's like that point, right? They're always open to say, look, this is really not true. What this authority said is not really proved. I've seen otherwise, right? And there wasn't much of there were no chances of attrition in this sense, even with official culture by a great margin. And the reflection of this other pre-scientific dimension can be easily seen, for example, in heraldry treatises or in the ones of alchemy, where animal symbology was kept being used to express moral philosophical realities, right? So the actuality of the Bestiaries went therefore much further than the 13th century. The model of the Bestiary is a treatise written in perhaps the 2nd century AD in Greek and called Physiologos. So the one who understands fundamentally nature as such. There were roughly 50 animals who were taken in consideration and to which were associated scriptural quotes, right? So it was in this way was founded a Christian typology of the animal, right? A name which was the association of a zoological picture and of a Christological idea. And translations of the Physiologus were soon produced in Syrian, in Armenian, in Ethiopic, and naturally, since up to the 4th century, in Latin. So this was a continued process. This thing was kept being read and translated, and it had time to spread fundamentally in Europe. So if you happen to be amazed by exotism of the medieval symbolical fauna, you have to take into account two aspects. First of all, that the men and the ideas and the images with both of them at the time traveled at that time, in fact, much more than we usually think. This is probably one of the most underrated aspects of medieval civilization. I mean, how fast news information traveled, right? The myth that the Middle Ages was just scattered villages that didn't know about what happened out there, it's complete nonsense. People actually traveled a lot, like not the average person, of course, but the idea that there was always someone that on a regular basis would travel, right? And even individuals, especially this time, considered the monastic source productions, right, that show this incredible, not just variety of animals specifically, but of landscapes, of certain, environmental descriptions that you would say, but my god, but this person's been there, and you know that this person has not moved from the monastery. And the reason being, there were people plenty actually of, there were even monks traveling, being ambassadors, emissaries, things like these, but also effectively going, on pilgrimage and sometimes seeing these real things and getting to know, especially manuscripts and other information. So this happened because there was a much greater value attached to knowledge, right? The medieval man on average had a dramatically and incredibly higher appreciation of knowledge that we have today. I mean, no doubt about this, right? We with the knowledge we have, we largely don't make not even a small amount of use that the medieval man did. Theoretically and practically. And so, for example, and that consider even the art of the steppes, right? You consider this transcontinental movements in also at a cultural level. The art of the steppes and the impact, the legacy that it left in Romanesque iconography. Look at all the capitals and the various animals. You'll see that you look at the previous models of the various mythologies, etc. You see that there is a deep legacy coming from the steppe, coming from this this really different, not just spatial but cultural dimension that had its own impact of this set of stories and information that remained in the memories and the tales in folklore, in the common knowledge of people at the time. And secondly, what is very important to bear in mind always is that the principal source for such symbolical fauna is in fact the Physiologus, that drew its animals essentially from two books of the Bible that are the Deuteronomium and the Leviticus. So, also the idea of complexion, I mean the idea that the creation doesn't have anything that you can leave for something or someone else, right? Our thinking today is very, very narrow by definition because, of course, there is much more to know and we need to operate as selection. But once again, we presume that that thing we know individually or, collectively within a specific community is what matters and we exclude the rest, right? Medieval minds didn't reason like this. Right, they were aware, of course, of their own, specificity, but it was a task for them to be aware of the reality as it was, because it was always potentially useful. Doesn't matter where this information came from or what, whether it was close or far to their own culture, but it was part of a bigger picture. This is not even the idea of creation as a monotheistic idea. This is something that already existed before, and that was at the base of same monotheism after all. I mean, they all stemmed also from similar bases, in this regard. I think the Bible being very rich in this symbology, in this occult. So all this world spoke a very similar language, culturally speaking, right? There were much less differences, many ways than there are today, even on just register of, let's say, on actual patterns of interpretation. So the tradition started by the physiologos in Latin, penetrated deeply the medieval culture, right? But the allegorical reading of the animals, this changed, right? If anything, it went complicating itself through the use of other interpretative keys, let's say. And this naturally increased over time, especially in a Europe that was somewhat detaching itself. Yes, it was a communication, but think about the early Middle Ages that see these various split kingdoms that are not tied together by a greater one, right? So the re-intensification for a more standardized rationalistic scientific interpretation is something that was reached at the acme of universalism in the 13th century. But it's obvious that there were some changes, there were some shades. There was, as we've seen before, a great diversification in this thinking. This was due to apparently banal aspects such certain exterior, let's say, analogies between animals, right? It's very common to see in this, it's very easy to see in the illuminations I've uploaded here, how, I don't know, elephants represented with the head of a cat, but just with a longer nose, right? Because for who had never seen an elephant, you don't know how that really is, and therefore you try to reconnect it with another animal that you know, or a certain typology that you think. Naturally, these people didn't have quite a scientific category. They couldn't separate a pachyderm from a phalid, right? So the thing is relevant in here, and this created complications. But there are also other patterns of interpretation, such as numerical relations or similar colors, right? That were all loaded with a great symbology, historically speaking, in philosophy, in the science of the time. Even certain elements of etymological or pseudo-etymological type, for example, Isidore Seville, dealing about animals in the 12th book of his Etymologia, was using Pliny, the Physiologus, but also Varro, Virgil, Ovid, and he founded and accepted certain legions, certain others that he actually got, he excluded them. He states that he knew them, but he said, this is probably wrong because, I've seen this other stuff that kind of contradicts it. And he was trying, however, also to make sense of the scientific issues in an etymological way. In fact, the etymology as such, as is the title of the work, that, however, followed debatable criteria from a scientific point of view, of course, at the time. We must still understand, right? And that would call homophonics, right? Or pseudo-homophonics, even. For example, the beaver, right? In Latin, it's castorus, like in vernacular was known as such, castorus. That etymologically speaking comes from castor, which means shiny, right? From Greek. And instead, Isidorus basically said that the castorus was called like this because it was, because of he entrenched himself with tree logs, right? And therefore they formed a castra, right? Which is the Latin name for the encampments, the military encampment, right? So this is just one example, but to make you understand the weirdness of the whole thing, because eventually the etymology, as we were saying before, would be considered as the main, like the first encyclopedic, like the most quoted, in fact, Christian encyclopedia, medieval times, especially up to, as we've seen, the 12th, 13th century. And which meant in turn that every scholar that wrote went back looking at what did Isidore of Seville right? I must take that in account. He was an authority in this regard. And the mistake replicated itself. In the 12th century, a very important, great and famous bestiary was the one attributed, at least for a long time, to Hugh of Saint Victor, right? By the title, or with the title of the Bestis et Aliis Rebus, right? While by the mid 12th century, Hugh of Foulois wrote an aviarium, so a work about birds. And a great spread also had the Liber Monstruorum, so the Liber of Monsters, that made by an Anglo-Saxon author, perhaps of the 8th century. During the 13th century, there was also this flourishing of bestiaries written in vernacular. Bible, feathers, legions, and oriental images penetrated in Europe from the culture of the steppes or through the narrative text of for example, the expedition of Alexander in India, right? And later on through the travelers' accounts, the allegorical figures assumed from scriptural passages of prophetic or eschatological theme, the signs that appeared, or that however were signaled in the heavens, like in the sky, the individual and collective visions which happened, and we know they still happen in certain parts of the world where this pre-scientific idea realization of world is present, right? The astrological symbols. So these are all those elements that make up the medieval imaginary zoology, that therefore as such, once again, it's not a mishmash of fantasies, right? Doesn't matter if the sources are many, also, which are, to be taken into account. There's always a logic here, a language, grammar, syntax, and etymological development that confer to semantics a great adventurous character, right? And decodifying that is feasible, right? And it's a way also to desecrate it, to disenchant it, even unwillingly, right? Not on purpose, right? But we can actually try, in fact, to maintain part of its sacrality, right? And an enchantment that we have to always to remember was there at the time. But most of all, we have to make the effort to understand it, right? To think of why this interpretations had such a great importance for them, what the figure of the animal in its environment, its symbology, its character, it's being developed from. Because otherwise, that what emerges is just a flattened version of the story. It's a way of, once again, just looking at pictures, saying, wow, this is medieval stuff, but then stopping there, right? Instead, we can go beyond. We can look at the main reason for which this system developed by realizing that it was not an isolated one, that this is not the fruit of the imagination of a single author out of pure fantasy, but that there is always a function behind this. And this is so difficult for us sometimes because for us it's become relatively simple to frame information. Right? We know that there is more or less a system, a standardized system we can trust in a way, at least from a scientific point of view, and therefore it just takes to fact check the source, right? At the time it wasn't like that. At the time it consisted in really providing an information on the base of a reality that was yet to be deciphered, and that in this sense entailed also a moral commitment in the scientific inquiry as such. And naturally lots of other motivations, but that are never ever just plain imagination. They always are framed within a world that has to, in which these ideas have to make sense. Because otherwise this stuff would have not come directly to us. And this is a concept that should be better expressed through all a series of other, studies of enormous range, even, just art, architecture, literature, but even music, because the world that we're seeing here now, and this is probably the thing that we rarely do when we think about the Middle Ages, because we assume that it was already a kind of a post, I can't say ancient, but say post-pagan world. But even this is a wrong idea. I mean, the concept, considering this view, in fact, this realization as essentially part of a irrational past, or even worse thinking than the Middle Ages were irrational in this regard, and they had kind of fallen from the ancient world. Absolutely not. Right, that realizing that the knowledge, the human knowledge at the time, was emerging literally from these magics. Right, we give for granted, I don't know, that from the times of the Greeks and the Romans, everything was, as we were saying before, all rational and secular. It was not. Right, there was just a beginning in these most developed societies that approached also monotheism, and or this sometimes even atheism, in maybe atheism not as such as we mean it, but let's say with the idea of a demiurgus, at least, with gods who were somewhat passive to it, so a greater fate that eventually, was also sublimated as God in other ways. But let's say in this world that considered already the superstition as not a viable way of, describing the world, but the overwhelming majority of every single society at the time believed firmly in this stuff, and there was no other way of looking at the world like. So the Middle Ages is this, gradual passage in which there is an improvement in the idea of classification, after all, in which, the surprise gets a little bit, there's more a reflection than a surprise in this regard. But that still emerged from a pre-scientific thinking. These people didn't know what modern physics was, and how do you think they could understand the world otherwise? Meaning that they actually understood their world their own way, right? It's not that they didn't, right? They did, and they did it also pretty well, because if you look at the symbology, well, it has such a deep meaning, overall, metaphorically speaking, allegorically speaking, to make sense of that specific world, and that's the real value that you can get from these interpretations, because this knowledge was really the sap for dealing with the world at the time. And what's knowledge after all, if we don't use it for this? Would you think that our world today has kind of an objective awareness of reality? It never has. It's never had it. It will never have it, because we fundamentally get the knowledge that we need at the moment to do certain particular things. And that's why we can kind of fail now to understand naturally the world of 1,000 years ago, because we don't have the reasons for doing it most of the times. But what is also very fascinating is that a great part of what we look from about the medieval world is actually still present in our world. Right? Probably the Middle Ages as such are the single most influent era in our present, in proportion. There is no doubt, I think, about this. Then, easily, then even the ancient world, the modern age, right? There is no proportion, I think, in terms of, I don't even, of cultural, I would say, synthesis and legacy, and in terms of what we still use today compared to these other ages than what the Middle Ages did. And this is really a different topic. I discussed it elsewhere on the Gnoti Seuton playlist, but we will deal with it on another occasion, better at least. But just remembering that, once again, we can't even detach ourselves from this world. We can't presume that we are something different from it, and that therefore we don't have any way of understanding it, or that our way of understanding it, it's limited at the point of non-understanding, because much of what we can read within these sources is something you can easily relate to. Emotionally, if you're even from literature, or even rationally at some level, right? Because also when we study history, we make sense of it through these very sources. So once again, we do have the capabilities of interpreting this, and we shouldn't be discouraged in this regard. But anyhow, this is yet another aspect, and next time we will start with some animal and dedicating an entire video to it, and so everything will be clear, right? As long as you remain aware of this openness, of this graduality, but also this continuity that existed all through millennia in realizing what these creators were seen like and why, the reason for, right? But anyhow, so for now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.